Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Good. Do you also see the pop-up text that I'm getting from my coworker? No. Okay,
No.
good. Even better. Even better. Okay, so I thought, what could I talk about? And so today I want to bring to you something that I don't know how to do, which is how to solve modern problems. Well, really, it's vintage conservation problems with modern focus. That's what I'm trying to do, and I don't really know how to do it, but we have a hypothesis that we're trying to test. And so I want to bring this hypothesis to see if it makes sense to you, see how we can make it work a little bit better and see if we can learn something about this. So if you are going to tune out, and arguably maybe you want to, but if you are, maybe this is something that I want to leave you with. And that is that environmental problems are and they're complex and solutions must keep up with time. And if you stay till the end of the talk, I'll give you 3 examples of why this makes sense. Hopefully this will resonate. But all jokes aside, this is really what we've been struggling is these are conservation problems that we've been trying to tackle for over a couple of decades. But we're bringing new solutions to see if that works a little bit better. So before that, I wanted to start with a little bit of history. How do we get here? How do we get here in terms of the state of the art in terms of conservation? So, and since this is the story that I'm telling, I thought, I could arbitrarily start anywhere I want. So I'm starting with Alexander von Humboldt, right? And so the description of nature, and he made an amazing voyage in different places, and we gain a lot of knowledge in terms of understanding how nature works. And around this time, there were a lot of people that that increased our understanding of how nature works. But I really like Alexander von Humboldt's approach to things, and so I thought I should start there, understanding how nature works. And then we gain a little bit more understanding. We realized that we could actually do things that could alter populations, and we could actually alter these populations to what we wanted to do. In this case, Aldo Leopold, not only did he increase our understanding of how nature works, but also, we could see that if we hunt some species or some individuals, populations could rise or fall. And so that understanding was instrumental to knowing how we can affect systems. And then to me, a critical point in time was when this paper was published around 1985. And this is, to me, I think, at least the place or the time where conservation biology was born as a scientific body of work with, you know, with topics and, a lot of ideas. And this was instrumental. And the cool thing about conservation biology in this paper was this idea that it involved, thinking about solving problems from different perspectives and from different disciplines within biology. Because what also started happening is, the systems that we studied with ecology, trying to understand how species interact with each other, we started seeing that they were starting to collapse. And so this is really what brought a lot of like-minded folks to try to see, okay, so what is, or what could be one of the explanations for this decline of the species X that I'm trying to study. And so Soleil really laid down this framework saying, conservation biology has to do with social science and ecophysiology and mental monitoring and all these cool stuff. Um, and and we made really, really big advancements in terms of understanding how we can help these systems, how we can improve the health of these ecosystems and these species. And then there was another development in terms of our thinking, which at least from my point of view, is when this paper was published, November 2012, Peter Careva and Michelle Marvier publishes this paper, What is Conservation Science? Again, we're talking about conservation biology, and they're saying, there's this new thing called conservation science. And from their perspective, conservation science grabs conservation biology and expands it. So it's like pretend you're double clicking on that social science, and it opens up a whole bunch of new stuff. And really we're talking about economics and climate science and public health and philanthropy and sociology. And this is really the wheelhouse of TCD, really. But then, I mean, if you ask me, it's we're still under the same framework, but we're expanding a little bit more, and we're calling it something differently. But it's I don't think it's fundamentally different, but I do think it's being a little bit more specific in terms of what are the disciplines that we need to use in order to tackle complex problems. But then the problem that I had when I started working with TNC is, okay, fine, have this framework, but how exactly do these disciplines fit in terms of helping me solve a complex problem, right? So, I mean, where does ecology fit in, and economics and political science? Where exactly do they fit in? Because it, in my job at TNC, I need to bring conceptual frameworks and apply them to really try to change the systems where we work, right? And so I needed an answer to this. And the good thing is that we had a good place to work, which is Latin America, right? So in case you're not familiar, I'm pretty sure everyone's familiar, but we're talking about a pretty important place. So 40% of species, 25% of forests. It's super important. 20% of the land in Latin America is under indigenous populations and local people stewardship, which is huge. And but we have huge challenges. There is no other region in the world that has suffered biodiversity loss like Latin America. This was published last year, I think, and this is the Living Planet Index from WWF. And what they do is they they've created an index which is related to relative abundance. So this is not number of species, but really how many individuals of the different species that live in different places. How does that fluctuate over time? And yes, you could argue that this has some holes, but at least it's some data that we have consistently throughout the decades, so we can see how biodiversity is changing in different continents. And if you compare all the regions in the world, you'll never find a place like Latin America that has loss. And you can see 94% loss from 1970. And that is absolutely huge. And in my mind, it is completely unacceptable. And the system that is leading us to this biodiversity decline is completely unacceptable. And we have, in my mind at least, we have a very unique position to be able to do something about it. So it's not just saying, oh, this is so overwhelming. What are we going to do? No, I think we're in a position that we can do something about it and we can work together. So that's the other message that I have. And if there's something that I learned is that we don't have to work on tough problems by ourselves. And that there's a very powerful thing there because we can actually tap into the collective intelligence of the group of people that we work with. And so, yes, and so that was the first realization. Business as usual is no longer an option. We can do something about that. And bringing you to the place I work, in case you don't know much about the Chaco, we're talking about the world's largest dry forest. This is a pretty big place. We're talking about a place that is as big as Spain and France combined. It's huge. So most of it is in Argentina, 60%, but the rest of it is scattered throughout Bolivia, Paraguay, a tiny little bit of Brazil, and it has suffered tremendous habitat loss. We have lost over, well, just under 25% of the natural cover of this forest, and that was huge. But it's also a good place to start trying to understand how exactly do we do conservation in this place and modern conservation. Um, and again, it's not about number of hectares, but it's about people. And sometimes it's important to highlight the fact that that it's not a separate entity, people and nature. It's one and the same. Like for example, Pasión. Pasión is this lovely woman here, and Christina and I have worked with Pasión for a number of years, and Pasión lives in the middle of the forest. So if she gets sick, she needs to travel almost probably about 8 hours, 9 hours to the closest hospital if she ever gets sick. And she raises goats. But the problem is that her goats need to travel further and further away from her house to feed because the land is so degraded. And habitat degradation doesn't only affect Pasión, but it will affect Pasión's children and grandchildren and the sustainability of the system. And we need to act now because in the Gran Chaco, there are over 46 million hectares that could suffer severe habitat loss. And in the face of climate change, this is going to be a huge problem. And you can see how habitat, nature, ecosystem services and people are all intertwined and it's one and the same. And Pasión is just one example because we also have the case of Lucas. So Lucas is another person that we work very closely with, and he manages his family farm. He grows one of the best cattle that you can think of. And he is a business person. He runs his family business. And the easiest way for Lucas to make a profit is to increase the amount of surface where he can grow cows. That's the easiest way. And again, he's a business person. And if he doesn't do that, he's going to have to sell his company to another group of people that can manage it for him. But the amazing thing about Lucas is he wants to find ways to become profitable and conserve nature. And so finding alliances with folks like Lucas, I think, is absolutely fundamental. And the reason why we need to work with folks like Lucas is because if we don't do something about it, we could lose in the Gran Chaco over 1.3 million hectares before the end of the decade. That's a lot of land that we can lose to deforestation again. So this is the system. Now the question is, how do we change a system? Well, what we did is step one is try to understand the system. And we had some really good tools to let us to a better understanding of the system. So we started with systematic planning, and you're all very familiar with this. This is something that TCD does really, really well. But if you're not familiar with this, it's really a way of thinking that lets you understand what you want to conserve, what is threatening this system, and what you can do about it. And you can do this in a way where you can see how different factors affect each other and what you can do to actually change this system. And so that was the first step, and it has led us to something really cool, which is a better understanding. So we realized that really when we're talking about land use, we know that we have a subsystem, a social subsystem with actors that interacts in an ecological subsystem. And that interaction is actually what creates the land use. But that doesn't occur in isolation. This is all affected by motives and economic context and institutions. What are the rules for that system and the actor characteristics? And if you put all of that together, you can have recurrent, typical patterns that are identifiable with satellite images. And that's really cool because not only can you understand what the system is made of, but also what is the spatial footprint of these different subsystems, if that makes sense, right? And this was published last year. And then if you have that understanding, then you start seeing some conservation opportunities and what are the challenges of each of those systems. And so that's really what we did. We knew that we had a set of subsystems in the Gran Chaco, but really the main threats were habitat loss and habitat degradation. So really going back to Lucas Invasión, right? That's really what we refer to when we're talking about habitat loss and degradation. But then what can we do about it? Well, according to our system analysis, we realized that we needed to do three things if we wanted to increase our chance of success. Because sometimes you apply one strategy, but if that fails and you put all your eggs in that basket, then your whole efforts go down the drain. And so we decided that we would do three simultaneous strategies for systems transformation. One is we know we wanted to avoid further deforestation. And so what we did here is we implemented a project called VSEC that I'll tell you a little bit more about it. But VSEC is actually pretty cool because it lays down the groundwork for turning the Chaco from a deforestation hotspot to a supplier of deforestation-free commodity. And that is huge. But that's not it. We needed to increase the levels of protection. So in case you're not familiar, there's a global commitment of trying to achieve 30% protection by 2030. Whether you can say, that's a big number, that's a low number, but in the Chaco, we're less than 5%. And that is definitely a small number. We're really, really far away, and we need to increase the level of protection, especially in Argentina, because the largest national parks that we have in the Gran Chaco are both in Bolivia and in Paraguay. But in Argentina, comparatively speaking, we have very, very little protection. And we need to combine protection of land, but also freshwater resource. And we need to think about protection mechanisms that are durable in time and equitable. But also there's a huge opportunity to try to enable forest-based regenerative economies. So this is most of the forest in the Chaco is still standing, 70 something percent of it. And a lot of people live there and a lot of people produce food in the forest. That leads to a lot of degradation. So we know that there's an opportunity to change this part with regenerative economy. So really making sure that folks have economic opportunities that are based in a healthy forest system. And then the question is, how do you scale that up? Because we're talking about over 100 million hectares in the Chicago, again, trying to affect a piece of land as big as Spain and France. So how do you do that? Do you go door by door and, trying to convince landowners to do regenerative agriculture or do protected areas? Well, it's going to take forever if we went down that route. So we said, okay, we need to think about scaling mechanisms. And in our mind, scaling mechanisms are enabling conditions that you make sure exist so that folks can adopt whatever it is that you think the environment needs, or whatever it is that you agreed with local communities that the scope of the work should be. And so in our mind, this has to do with strengthening local capacity, influencing public policy, and thinking about finance. It could be, blended finance or carbon markets or there's a whole suite of different flavors of financial solutions. But really, we're talking about the enabling conditions so that folks can apply a regenerative ranching system or any of the other strategies that we're talking about here. And here we go with the three examples that I promised you at the beginning of my talk. So VSEC. VSEC really is more than a traceability system. So I mentioned that we're trying to turn the Gran Chaco from a deforestation hotspot to a global provider of deforestation-free commodities. And we're starting with soy. And so what we did is we worked with the main stakeholders that trade soybean in Argentina, but also globally. So if you think about how the soybean market works, it's kind of like an hourglass. You have a lot of consumers, and then you have very few traders, and then you have a whole bunch of producers. So we thought, okay, where in this hourglass can we affect change? And we thought, well, why don't we get that middle part, the traders, because those are, we're talking about 5 or 6 global traders, Cargill, Bunge, LDC, Lewis Dreyfus, and if we can talk to them and come to an agreement in terms of what's the future, then that could cascade up and down the chain. And it also helped the fact that the European Union said, you know what, starting in the year 2025, we will only purchase commodities that come from places that are deforestation free. So that was a huge opportunity. So we started working very, very, very strongly on this. And again, with a whole bunch of people, we did not do this alone. But we got into an agreement. We built a governance structure, and then we went to the technical part. You know, the traceability. How do we trace individual soybean and continue that traceability all the way to the European buyer, which is ultimately what we want to do. And so we have this traceability system from producers to storage to processing all the way to export. And if you want to know more about this system, you can ask me. But the cool thing about this is that it's a solution that we thought of with key stakeholders and that has a technical solution built in, and I think that's kind of cool. And as a result, I personally think VSEC is a game changer, and we finished the first shipments of deforestation-free soy and beef as well. So this has a spillover effect into the beef industry, which right now is one of the largest forces driving land use change in the Gran Chaco. But as a result, Argentina is the first country that is ready to supply the European Union with deforestation-free soy and beef, and that is huge. And the national government, well, the national government before the new president took office actually adopted BSEC as the national platform for tracking deforestation-free stuff, and so this was fantastic, and it was an absolute win for us, and we were so happy. But that's not it, you know, because then what happens when you have another government that really wants to do things in another way, right? Uh, so we have agreements with the traders, but maybe we stop gaining traction in terms of the national platform. So this again, try to diversify the risk of your strategies. And so we started working really hard with regenerative food systems to trying to work with solutions or come up with solutions with people like Sion and a lot of local organizations that have decades of experience on the ground. And when we're talking about transitioning to regenerative food systems, really what we're saying is let us transition from conventional agriculture that degrades soil and that has impacts to biodiversity and transition all the way to regenerative food systems, which require much less inputs, are less costly, and that are much closer to nature. And in the Gran Chaco, we can think of a system that is forest-based and that is actually much more resilient to changes in climate. And just to be a little bit more concrete, we developed a business model which includes a management strategy for cattle that not only does it restore degraded areas, but also uses non-timber forest products as a feeding supplement for cattle, which is fantastic because in a place that is super dry like the Gran Chaco, you need to diversify your feeding sources. And so that's what we're trying to do, and we're starting the first pilots this year. And the potential for impact is huge. So if you look at this map, each one of these dots is a smallholder producer in the Gran Chaco that has a forest-based system. Now look at the spatial footprint of that type of production. It's absolutely massive, massive, and the opportunity for delivering impact is absolutely massive as well. But how do you finance that transition? I mean, it's fantastic to have a way of producing cattle that it's more environmentally friendly, but really for that transition to occur, that costs money. And we're talking about communities that are very poor, and we're talking about communities that, even though they're poor, but they represent over 80% of the cattle ranchers in Argentina. So it's a huge population. But we need finance to transition. And so that's the third example, the finance, which is one of our scalability bets. And finance is really important in Argentina. First, if you look at the left-hand side, you will see that really Argentina, in comparison to other countries in Latin America, doesn't have a lot of banking credit available. Just 6% if you compare it to a Latin American average of 47%. So if the ratio between the credit that is available to the GDP is really, really low. And within that 6%, if you were to double click, most of the credit is available for other activities and consumption. Only 5% is available for agriculture, and less than 3%, less than 4% is available for cattle. So virtually there's no credit to use for transitioning into regenerative systems. So that was another challenge. And so that's one of the things that we're working on. And we came up with this toy model that hopefully we'll be able to test this year that I think it's kind of cool. So let's go from the ground up. So you have producers, right? And this is a case that was built for honey producers, but it could work for cattle. So you have producers. And then if you can organize producers in a in a co-op, in some kind of association, and then you link that association with an importer of that good. It could be cattle, it can be honey, whatever. And then the importer actually functions as the link with an impact fund. So this impact fund, we thought that it could have, different flavors, but it could have maybe some philanthropic composition, but also some patient capital, some insurance, and also some impact investment. And so if you're not familiar what these terms mean, so for example, impact investments is folks that want to have a return on their investment, but they want to invest in something that has either environmental benefits or social benefits or something like that. And so if you bring together these groups into a fund and you make them interact with the importer, then the importer is the body that actually acts as an insurer in terms of the financial capacity, so that the producers don't need to show the financial capacity, because in this scheme, what the producers do is they repay with goods, which is what they're already good at. And then our role with TNC is making sure that all the parts talk to each other, and most importantly, the technical assistance. And so I'm cautiously optimistic about this little toy model. We'll see how it works, but then, it's definitely worth testing, because, again, business as usual is not an option for us. And also, in these few years, we've definitely learned a lot, because we made a lot of mistakes, and I think it's good to share these mistakes and some of the lessons learned. And one is, we definitely cannot work alone, and neither do we want to work alone. We need to work with local communities, but also with other organizations and academia, and just everyone. We need the best people to work on these problems, because they are really, really tough. And we need to embrace failure and learning, but have a method to do so. And this is absolutely critical. So in all honesty, the financial solution that I showed you, I don't know if it's going to work. But you know what? We have a system that if it doesn't work, we're going to learn from it and we're going to improve upon it. And then next year we're going to have a better system. And the next year we're going to have an even better, until we fix it. And we don't do this because we're smart, but we do it because we have a method that really helps us learn from our mistakes and not wait until we have everything, figured out, because we need to act quick. And so this is I think is something absolutely critical. And then patience and consistency. This is key. And again, if I were to sum up the entire talk, we've started from Alexander from Humboldt, understanding nature, and we've made such huge strides in terms of understanding how do we interact with nature and how do we affect nature and what can we do to help nature and people. And we have some components that are absolutely critical. We need to understand nature. That's first and foremost. But also we need to understand how different disciplines interact in terms of building a narrative that helps us change the system. We need to really try to aim to change the system and then have a method that allows us to integrate all of it together. Um, so just to show you before I finish, what are we thinking about in terms of next year? And I'm actually really excited because we're also starting a protection strategy. Again, diversifying your strategies to increase your odds of success. And this is something that's really cool because we're going to start with a somewhat small pilot in a few 100,000 hectares to combine different approaches for protection. So it's not just creating national parks, but it's also, you know, creating indigenous-led protected areas and working lands, and some other innovative ways of protecting forests, and also integrating regenerative cattle with timber with a focus on indigenous people and local communities. There's such a huge part of the social fabric of the Gran Chaco. And then thinking that sometimes when at the national level things can change, then that really is a huge invitation to think creatively in terms of where can you find allies? And in our case, we can find allies in provincial government. So Argentina is a federal government, and that means there's a certain level of autonomy in the provinces. And so we're strengthening our links with the local provincial governments to work together. Because if we can find out ways to incentivize something at a provincial level, just think about the scaling potential that you have. And again, take advantage of all the technical developments in terms of software and AI, and these really are tools that can help us solve some wicked problems. And so for example, uh, one big problem is that folks don't always trust traceability systems, but with technology, you can really think of traceability systems that are agnostic in terms of trust and using blockchain to show that. And so that's something that we want to test this year again. And again, testing impact finance. So really testing things. We already have a plan. Let's start implementing. Let's start, having successes and failures and learning from those mistakes and do this as quickly as we can. Because whatever we learn won't stay with our own team, and it's probably going to spill over to other places. And this is something that is really exciting for me because, what, at least in TNC, what happens in Latin America doesn't stay in Latin America. And the same is true in other parts of the region. We're learning so much from our partners across the globe. That's absolutely fantastic. Because at the end of the day, we need to remember that we're talking about influencing people's lives and changing the system to ensure nature conservation in the long term. So that's it. I hope I didn't bore you to death. If you have any questions, let me know. Maybe I can stop sharing my screen and maybe we can start having a conversation.